Mhm. All right, good morning. 5 classes. That's it. I'm going to count them every day from here on out. I don't know why. I think that's going to be my new habit. And like, I just can't even believe that we're down to that. But then again, it feels like forever ago that we were online and not in person. That like it feels like another life. I don't know. And none of us are wearing masks, right? It's crazy. Everything changes so much, doesn't it? But 5 classes left. We'll get through the rest of the disorders today, and then depending on how much time we have, we might even start the therapies. We'll see if we get there or not. But let me see. Go back here. So we talked about this a little bit, but we were kind of at the end of our time, and I did have a clip of this that I wanted to play for you. So I'll do that here in just a moment. But again, these were the dissociative disorders. That's where we left off. We talked a lot about anxiety and some of the other ones. We do have a few other categories of disorders to get through. As a side note, there are quite a few other disorders in this category, and some of you were asking me questions about them after class, but there's definitely quite a few in here. This one's like the most commonly known, but there are several others, a lot of different types of amnesia and kind of feeling like things are unreal or you feel separated from your personality. But as I was sharing with you last time, this one is probably the most common. And that one interaction that I will remember forever, it's been featured in a lot of movies, right? Dissociative identity disorder, and sometimes really well. And other times they tend to blend it with schizophrenia, which is really confusing because they're not the same disorder. Schizophrenia, which we'll talk about later, is when people are like seeing things and hearing things and have strange beliefs about the world around them, but they only have one personality. Dissociative identity disorder, there's more than one personality, and they don't tend to have those other features that we could get really wild. Technically, you could have a personality that has schizophrenia. It'd be really uncommon, but it could happen. And the media loves to do that. Like they love to merge them together. Yeah. In Fight Club, yeah. Like, so in Fight Club, he has all these like hallucinations, and they're kind of blending the two. They do that often. And sometimes I think they do it for us as the viewer so that we can see what the character is thinking. And the clip that I have for you, they kind of do the same. Like, I'm going to play you a clip from, it was one of my favorite TV shows, Bates Motel, like a really, really cool take on Norman Bates and his some of his disorder stuff that he has that led to him being the killer that he was in Psycho. And they show his mom, right? And it's not typical that people see the other personality. I think sometimes they just do that for us so that we're not confused as the viewer. But let me play that for you. I think this is a good example, again, of how the different personalities can have different temperaments, different mannerisms. You can see when, and about that clip is, right, you see him at the end, he's talking about Norman in the third person, right? Like as if he was somebody else because he's assumed a different personality. And so his mannerisms are a little bit different. You can see he's got like a different way of relating and sitting. It's just really interesting when people switch personalities. Again, it can be wildly different, or it can be very subtle. For him, he switches to his mother and he commits murders as his mother and doesn't remember doing them. But for some, it can be just like little shifts throughout the day. It can be something that's much more dramatic. Typically, again, rooted in trauma, right? Like I said, for him, he had a lot of trauma as a child, and that's what led to his dissociative identity disorder. And that's really common. Trauma tends to lead to the development of another identity or several identities to try and survive. So I know we talked about it a bit last time, but any other like questions or thoughts or anything with DID, with dissociative identity disorder before we keep going? Any other thoughts? Yeah. So it is one of these disorders, right? So it is an example of a dissociative disorder. So there's depersonalization and derealization are two other ones that are actually way more common than this. And when people have derealization, things around them don't feel real, like it's almost like everything is blurry. And depersonalization is when you don't feel like you're like connected to your own body. Like you don't feel like your body is your own, or you look in the mirror and you don't recognize yourself, those kind of things. Those are actually very common dissociative disorders or elements. We were talking about that before, that sometimes they happen with panic attacks as well. yeah, those would be in this cluster. And like I said, much more common than DID, actually. The next group of disorders are the personality disorders. There are 10 of them. And we're only going to talk about the two kind of most dramatic of them, if you will. But there are 10. And every single one of us has a personality. Right? And we didn't cover this necessarily in person, but you covered it on Canvas. But we each have a unique and enduring pattern of thoughts, feelings, and behavior that make us who we are. You only have one personality, or you have the disorder we just talked about, right? But one personality makes you who you are. Personality disorders, super controversial because here the disorder is your personality. It's everything about the way that you relate to other people. It's everything about how you interact with the world, your behaviors, your thoughts, your emotions. People have very inflexible and maladaptive ways of thinking and behaving, and it leads to problems. Leads to distress, conflict with others, problems in all sorts of areas of your life. These are things that are thought to be almost genetic and inborn, but they can develop and become more severe over time. And there, as I said, 10 of them, but we'll just talk about the two biggest ones. And I put in the slides a list of the 10. They tend to be divided up into ones that are kind of odd in nature, ones that are more like anxious and fearful, and ones that are more dramatic. And the two that we're going to talk about fall into the dramatic category because they tend to be a little bit more dangerous and a little more like emotional for people. And those are borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder is very dangerous to self. It has a lot of things in common with bipolar, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But with borderline personality disorder, you have individuals who have a lot of instability in their emotions, their identity, their mood, their relationships. There's a lot of like black and white thinking, love, hate, kind of putting people up on a pedestal and like idealizing them and then completely devaluing them on the other side. Very difficult disorder to live with and also to be like friends with somebody who has it or partners with somebody who has it, especially if it's on the more severe end of the spectrum. Tends to be a lot of like impulsivity and instability, oftentimes self-harming behaviors and kind of reckless, impulsive behaviors are relatively common. Anyone know someone with borderline personality disorder? Any thoughts or comments or anything about it at all? Or so? No? Yeah?
I mean, I think
Mhm.
it sounds exactly what it would be.
Okay.
Total switches and mood and personality.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's often, we call it reactivity of mood. It's like a very overreactive response to just about everything. And it can be very little things that set people off. And it's relatively like, it's not an uncommon disorder. It's just one of the more severe disorders. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, so
Yeah.
no, I'm like the severe mood spectrum reactive, since I didn't know what it actually meant.
Sure. Yeah, it's something that tends to start, like I said, really early in life. Most personality disorders, we try not to diagnose until you're 18, right? Just because you're going through adolescence, there's a lot of identity change and so on. But with this one, what you see, what's really characteristic of this is that love-hate thing, where you maybe like you love someone so much you don't even know what to do with those feelings. Like you care about them so much and they're perfect, they're everything you ever wanted, and then they do something really small that's off. And I hate you. How did I ever love you? Like, I don't want to be with you anymore. The second that person leaves, though, like, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it. Please don't leave me. And trying to get them back. It's this like cycle that tends to happen, which can be very difficult to be patient with on the other end of that. But yeah. Yeah, of course.
So I often talk to myself, something wrong with there. And then, and so it's just like, but they're human.
Yeah.
So I just, what I mean, what is it?
Right. And where do you draw the line, right? And there's no really good answers to that is the hard part. Like we all have the elements of all, like who in here, like I won't ask you to admit it, but I'm sure all of us have had that, like, I love you, I hate you, like pissed off maybe way more than we should be, or, you know, have a lot of changes in identity, or maybe we're, you know, doing some of these things, like every single one of these disorders we talk about, we all have to some degree, right? But when it starts to cause you problems, like you lose friendships because of it, right? Or relationships because of it. You can't hold a job because your behavior is so impulsive and reckless that you get fired over. Or your partners are leaving you because you're not able to balance some of this out. That's when we start to get to a disorder. But sometimes it's hard to know, especially if you have them in like a mild way. And oftentimes people learn to live with disorders, right? And they learn to live with them pretty well. And people who don't know well might not ever know you have it, right? So it's tricky. And I think it's super normal to ask yourself, like, is this me or is this whoever? That's really normal. And you don't have them all. I promise you don't have them. There's no way that you can have every disorder that we talk about. If you've ever seen Girl Interrupted or read the book Girl Interrupted, the main character, Winona Ryder's character, is a great example of borderline personality disorder, like self-harming behaviors. It's a really great book and movie as a side note if you're interested in psychology. You get some mental hospital stuff in there and a lot of disorders. And then Angelina Jolie's character is a great example of this one. So you get kind of both in the same movie. But antisocial personality disorder is the other really kind of dramatic and severe one. And this one has two common names. Anyone know what they are? Common ways that we refer to this? Yeah. The sociopath. There's one more. Anyone know the other one? Yeah. Psychopath, right? So if you've ever heard someone say sociopath or psychopath, the technical name for both of those is antisocial personality disorder. Now, psychopath and sociopath actually refer to the suspected causes and the way that it might manifest. But the technical name for all of that is antisocial personality disorder. And this has been in just countless shows. Dexter, right? If you watch Dexter, though, he doesn't really fit it. If you watch the newer one, the newer season, he kind of lost, like he had way more empathy and way more connections. Like, I don't think they portrayed it so well anymore, but the original Dexter definitely fit this. The Joker in the Batman movies, really good example. I just watched the new Batman like last night. Did you like it? It was all right.
Who's better, this Batman or the Christian Bale Batman?
Yeah, I'm gonna go Christian Bale, but they're very different, right? I'm like, all I could see is Edward. I'm like, it's Edward in Batman suit. Like, I'm like, he's not sparkling, right? I don't know. I thought he was great when he had the Batman suit on. Sad Bruce Wayne, in my opinion, but I don't know. Yeah, I know. He was, and he was supposed to be like, I know we're on the like sidetrack, but he was supposed to be such a like public figure. He felt like an angsty teenage vampire when he was Bruce Wayne. Like that's all I can see him as that, like Cedric Diggory. Like I don't know. But I had a hard time believing it. But I thought he was good in the suit, like as Batman. Like he had the right jawline. I don't know. I don't. Anyway, but like the Joker character would be a great example of this, or maybe even the Riddler in the new Batman. So many other ones. I'm just thinking about the top. Joffrey, great character from Game of Thrones, would fit this. It's just there's a ton of them. There's so many portrayals of this. Hannibal Lecter, Alex from A Clockwork Orange. You go on. But with this, what you get is often somebody who's very like has no empathy or like ability to put themselves in somebody else's perspective. And then oftentimes is a little bit either like violent or unethical in their behavior. It doesn't always have to be violent criminal behavior, but that's relatively common. There's a lot of like exploiting other people and not caring about others or feeling any kind of guilt or remorse. And there's oftentimes kind of a superficial charm that can come with this. A lot of those characters that I just mentioned have like a very superficial charm to them, at least when they want to. And they tend to be really good at like luring you in, but then don't care at all about your feelings or your needs, and oftentimes will exploit or harm you if it suits them in some way. So this one's very dangerous to others, right? And that one's very dangerous to self. Right? So these are probably two of the most dangerous of the personality disorders. Though, as I said, there are a bunch of them, and these are very pervasive patterns. So it goes across everything in your life, all of your interactions, and they tend to be relatively common. Very, very difficult to treat because it's your personality, right? How do you change your personality? It takes a lot to do. And you can learn to live with them. You can learn skills to challenge them, but it can be very difficult to make these go away. Yeah.
So like sadistic and like sadism, like tendencies, they fall under like antisocial personality.
It could, right? So are you talking more like not in more of like a sexual sense, like the S&M, like BDSM kind of stuff, but more just like harming other people, right? Yeah. Yeah.
So, is that like tendency acting for people with antisocial personality?
It can, and it doesn't always have to be like that violent and extreme, but that enjoyment of harming others and getting pleasure out of somebody else's like pain can come with this for sure. And he definitely had a lot of that in his character, right? I heard is it the prequel, right? It comes out this summer. So excited for that, right? I forget what it's called, but the prequel to Game of Thrones comes out this summer. So don't get me started on the last season of Game of Thrones. I could rant about that for like an hour. Is that Joffrey from Game of Thrones is a wickedly evil little dude. You should, if you ever watch the show, I don't want to ruin it, but if you ever watch it, he's definitely a very violent, evil, nasty little character. Game of Thrones. All right, the other really common group of disorders are the mood disorders. Second most common, anxiety being the first, mood being the second. So with mood disorders, we're talking about disturbances in mood, people who have prolonged emotional states or emotional extremes, being more up or more down than maybe is typical. And I always draw this in my abnormal psych class. We think about mood as being two ends of a spectrum or two poles, which is where the term bipolar comes from, which we'll get to in a minute. But on the low end of mood, we have depression. And on the high end of mood, the extreme high, we have mania. And then you can think about everything in here. It's kind of like normal or typical mood. Most of us kind of go back and forth on our normal, typical, like variations. Maybe we're a little higher, lower, depending on what happens. But it's normal to like move up and down the mood spectrum depending on things happening in your life. But people who are, way too extreme on one end or the other, or it lasts a really long time, or it's interfering with their life in certain ways, might qualify to be diagnosed with either depression or mania, or a combination of the two, which we'll talk about on the next slide. And I think most people are pretty familiar with depression, right? Depression is something that's very common. A lot of people struggle with depression, especially over these last 2 years. There's been just record cases of depression as people are isolated and losing the ability to interact with others. But depression is a lot of feelings of sadness, not being interested in the things that you used to be, a lot of like worthlessness and guilt, sleeping too much or not enough, eating too much or not enough, a lot of very low behavior. It's beyond sadness, right? Like if sadness were like maybe like right here, right? It's farther, right? This is like a very low state that's difficult to get out of. And if any of you know someone who has depression, it can be very spiraling, right? It can be hard to break the cycle of it and get out of depression. Same with mania, but this is definitely something that's much more common. On the high end of mania, this is an extreme up state. It's almost like somebody has taken way too many like stimulants in a way, but it lasts for about a week. To have a depressive episode, it has to last for at least 2 weeks. Some people, it's way longer. A manic episode is only 1 week, but they can be very damaging. A lot of people get themselves into trouble during manic episodes. They do behaviors that are reckless or impulsive or dangerous. They have what's called grandiosity. I can do anything, I can accomplish anything, usually with no merit or reasoning behind it. I just got all caught up. I don't know if any of you watch Ozarks or Ozark. Ben from Ozark is a great example of like someone struggling with like manic episodes. But those come out in what, like 2 days, waiting for the last episodes in 2 days. But lots of characters with this as well, very like up agitated states. It can be anger, or it can be more just like reckless, impulsive behaviors. Was that yeah, do you have a
Yeah. Is there sort of this that interest in dynamic, like where it's normal or
it's hard. The second people have a manic episode, we actually then typically diagnose them with bipolar disorder. So you can have manic episodes by themselves, but it's pretty rare that people only have mania and not depression. And by definition, right, when people have, if you've ever had a depressive episode or you've ever had a manic episode, then you end up with bipolar disorder. So pretty uncommon that people haven't had both. I mean, it's possible for sure, but it's not super, super common. So you can have one or the other, or you can have both. If you add them together, you get bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder used to be called manic depression. Right? And you can see why, manic and depression, right? You have both sides. But there's actually two different types of bipolar, which you don't need to know. But there's bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. And you can have like a light version of mania called hypomania. So they changed the name to bipolar disorder to reflect that. But it used to be called manic depression. And people who have bipolar disorder alternate back and forth between low and high, oftentimes with normal, typical mood in between for weeks or even months at a time. And this can almost feel like two different people. Right? I don't know if any of you have someone in your life who has bipolar disorder, someone that you know. I grew up with a mom who had bipolar disorder, and it was like, which version of her am I going to get today? Like every day, it was like, is she going to be the mom that doesn't get out of bed? Or is she going to be the, like, we're cleaning the house, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing this, and like a million miles a minute. Like it was, I never knew. My brother and I would always be like, which one? Okay, we're good. Right? Like, are you in the middle or are you one into the other? It can feel like two different people. You have somebody who, when they're on this end, they never get out of bed. They don't want to do anything. They feel worthless. And then they go over here. I can do anything. I do everything. I'm not going to sleep. Right? I have too much worth in a way. I'm grandiosity. And it can be very difficult to manage. Yeah. Sure.
But like I can like remember like she won't get out of bed, right? For like a long period of time when I was little, I used to be like, let's go do something. I like bother her, you know? And then like one day I remember this specific day when she was like having this high and she was like, oh my god, like let's go to the beach, just do this. As soon as we got to the park, she did her like move, boom. And she was like, we're not going.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? And she was running in bed.
It can be confusing, right? It's
Could that be like that?
yeah, I mean, so I think when most of us think of bipolar disorder, and I've heard people say this so often, like he's so bipolar, she's so bipolar, like from someone who, like whose mood is really reactive. So someone who's like really, really up and then 10 minutes later is really down. That's not usually bipolar as much as it's just poor emotional regulation or control. These tend to be longer cycles. As I said, a depressive episode usually lasts at least 2 weeks by definition of criteria, and mania 1 week. Now there's sometimes what we call rapid cyclers, people who go through it faster, but it's not like minute to minute, it's more like days or weeks at a time. So, but not to say that someone who struggles with mood might not have crazy wild mood like fluctuations, but that's more poor emotional regulation than it is bipolar disorder. But it could come with bipolar disorder, if that makes sense. Yeah.
It's like someone will say one thing and then just like, boom.
Yeah.
I get a different number.
Yeah, and that level of emotional reactivity might be more characteristic of borderline personality disorder, to be honest. Bipolar and borderline personality disorder have a lot in common. They're often misdiagnosed, they're often co-diagnosed, they're occurring together, which is called comorbidity. And they can both be mild or they can be severe. They have a lot in common between the two of them. Yeah.
So I didn't just talk about Psych.
Yeah.
Like, what would be the difference? And it's like hard to tell, like between rapid cycling and like the cycle of like personality.
Sure.
How different or can you
You know, it's looking for like the big picture, because like I said, a lot of the symptoms are very similar. Like there's a lot of reckless impulsivity that comes with a manic episode. And there's a lot of reckless impulsivity that comes with borderline. But looking at some of the trends, so somebody who has borderline personality disorder tends to be more prone to self-harming behaviors. It's not as common with bipolar disorder, though it can definitely happen. Someone who has bipolar disorder tends to go through longer cycles of mood, versus borderline tends to be more like quick reactiveness. So overreacting to little things rather than having like a period of depression followed by a period of mania. So somebody who's more like reactive like that and like thrown off very quickly probably fits borderline personality disorder a little bit better than somebody who has like a period of depression for a few weeks and then a manic episode and then back to depression and so on over longer spans of time. Yeah, but they're really often confused, right? And sometimes we just diagnose both because we're not sure. I think, yeah, no, I don't mind at all. Of course. Well, oh, they were for bipolar. So borderline personality disorder, I mean, you could use medication. Personality disorders, because it's everything about who you are. It's more working through it and finding better ways to control your emotions and stuff like that. I might use a mood stabilizer like you would with this, though the results are a little bit mixed if it's something more global like that. But yeah, I mean, oftentimes people will end up on medication. If they struggle with mood, they might end up on an antidepressant. And it could be helpful or it could require more like therapy and so on. Yeah. 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 So with personality disorders, you can't necessarily cure them, but you can learn to live with them. And a lot of people do, right? And learn to live with them fine, right? And so personality disorders tend to be more therapeutic, like in terms of learning coping strategies. And oftentimes people with bipolar disorder will go to therapy, but might require medication as well to kind of balance out the highs and the lows. And we'll talk about the medications and therapies. Yeah. 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 And the personality disorders are super controversial, partly for that reason. Like, how do we define normal? And we can't define normal. What's normal to each one of you is different. And what's normal today might not be normal tomorrow, right? And so it's a very difficult, controversial thing, especially when you're saying that like everything about you is disordered, right? And so as a group, personality disorders are very, very controversial. And it wouldn't shock me if at some point they change incredibly, because there's not a lot of agreement within that disorder group. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. They're often very misdiagnosed for that reason, right? What if you go into therapy and you only show like some of the symptoms? You might not see the whole picture, right? We often hide elements of ourselves. It might take a long time for them to emerge. So yeah, they're tricky. They're definitely tricky. I have an example of a manic episode. If you've seen Silver Linings Playbook, the main character, Pat, is a great example of someone struggling with bipolar disorder. His manic episodes tend to manifest as like anger and hostility. That can happen. Sometimes people even hallucinate if they're severe enough. But in this clip, you see him not sleeping, a little bit of violence, like rambling and talking, that pressured speech. There's a little bit of swearing in it, just to put that out there. I think there's only one swear word, but it's the title of this pack. But you see him not sleeping, right? 4 o'clock in the morning, he stays up all night reading a book. He gets angry, throws the book out the window, breaking the window, right? There's that like reckless kind of impulsive behavior. And then that pressured speech is very common. He goes in and wakes them up, is just talking and ranting and go pacing back and forth. Very common to see stuff like that in a manic episode, or like reckless spending or impulsive, dangerous kind of behavior, drug use. Things like that tend to happen. In a manic episode, people tend to have behaviors with a high potential for dangerous consequences. That's something that's relatively common. Yeah.
Yeah, I was about to mention. I don't know. Last year, I don't know. I'm not gonna diagnose him. I would say he was more like playing drugs, and I was in this Discord server. We were more like online friends, and he told me that he wanted to get like all his friends to meet up in my office. He was like, I'm gonna fly you out, and I'm gonna make you like a bad, I'm gonna make you a bad bitch, And I'm like, okay. And then because I'm like so unrealistic and like, maybe he says, oh, by the way, I kind of really want grocery money, can you like, cash out me?
But I'm gonna fly you out and
Yeah,
yeah,
and I'm like,
yeah.
made an excuse though, like, like I just like cut contact. Just because like I couldn't see him like I couldn't see him. Like I kind of just like hurt seeing him like
Sure.
I don't know, just it'd be everywhere. Because I knew that he like used drugs, and so like it was just like it was just really weird, and
Mhm.
it made me scared because like I didn't want him to know where I live, so I just cut out contact in case like he tried to come to me.
Mhm.
And so yeah, just like he was so adamant, and he was so determined to like get this done to fly people out. So like
Sure.
so, like,
But they didn't even have the money for like groceries, right? Yeah, and that's that like grandiosity of like, oh, I'll fly you out here, we'll do all that, but I can't even afford to like buy like my food, right? Just kind of not grounded in reality. But you mentioned drug use, and that's where it starts to get tricky. So we didn't talk about this necessarily too much here, but for every single disorder, there's a criteria that it has to meet. It can't be caused by a general medical condition or the use of a substance. So if somebody has issues because of using a drug, we actually qualify that as a drug abuse disorder. So it gets tricky. It's kind of like a chicken or the egg, debate, like which came first, right? Does somebody have depression because they used substances, or are they using substances because they're depressed? And you have to figure out what is driving what in order to decide how to treat it. So if that person was having all these symptoms because of a drug, technically we would consider that a drug abuse disorder, or we could say like drug-induced bipolar disorder. It's beyond the scope of what we're necessarily covering, but whenever there's substances involved, it makes it a little trickier, and it can make somebody's behavior even more erratic and unpredictable, right? There's a couple of
Also, like with the drug use, how say you were on like an antidepressant,
Sure.
and that causes mania, is that then that can't be like a drug?
Technically,
Would it?
yeah, so antidepressants are considered a psychoactive substance. I mean, traditionally, we don't diagnose, like, it gets so blurry, right? Traditionally, we think more of like recreational, like, or like illegal drugs, but it doesn't have to be. It could be, I mean, people can become dependent on anything from, from caffeine to antidepressants to heroin, right? It could be anything. But we don't tend to. Yeah, so we don't tend to diagnose it if it was prescribed by a doctor, but it could qualify. Technically, an antidepressant could qualify as a substance that could cause a disorder. But if it's under like a treatment umbrella, then typically we wouldn't go there. But it's not to say it's not possible. People can abuse antidepressants. A lot of people do. They take them improperly, or maybe even purchase them and use them when they're not prescribed them. So they can become a problem as well. Was there another? Yeah.
I don't know if she'd be able to, I'm not gonna say that, but she literally has 5 minutes of substance, she'll post that and
Sure.
it'll go really great. So it's like very high and low.
Yeah.
And she does everything, and then she'll try to do something to like help herself cope with the situation.
Mhm.
And I just want to know in that
Yeah. So, I mean, there's kind of two main approaches. One is medication, and one is more like coping skills and therapy. And they're often used together. Like if it's severe, people often require both. So you could take a medication, and we'll talk about these more later, called a mood stabilizer, that kind of brings the highs down and the lows up. So it kind of puts you more in the middle. But a lot of people don't like to take medications, or they can't tolerate the side effects of them. And so in therapy, it's a lot of like coping strategies, recognizing when you're in a manic state, like educating and recognizing, and then how am I going to have like a cope ahead plan for what I'm going to do when I'm in that frame of mind? How am I going to have a cope ahead plan for when I spiral down to depression? How am I going to get myself out of either end? And kind of learning to recognize and cope with them in a better way. And a lot of people do that on their own, but it can be really helpful to have someone help you with that therapeutically as well. So as a friend or a family member, patience, unfortunately, patience and compassion, and maybe even like a gentle nudge toward help, right? Oftentimes as a family member or friend, that might be the individual who's like, it wouldn't hurt for you to like, I'd love to see you get some support or some help, especially if it's interfering with somebody's life. But patience and compassion, sadly, is sometimes all we can do. And those can be difficult things to do when somebody is pushing you like that. Suicidality, very common with mood disorders. They correlate with each other very strongly. Oftentimes people who are overwhelmed with hopelessness consider something like suicidality, right? And it's often called a very permanent solution to a temporary problem. People, when they're suicidal, can't see that things are going to get better. They're overwhelmed with hopelessness. There's no hope for the future. And oftentimes you see these warning signs, but not always, right? If you know someone well, you probably see these things pretty well. But people talking about dying, big losses in your life, whether that's a job or a partner, or maybe somebody passed away, depression, changes in personality, giving away possessions. This is my prized whatever, but if something happens to me, will you take it? Right? Or like, I'm going to give this to you just in case something happens. And it's really atypical or abnormal of that person to do. People, as they get older, or maybe they're sick, fear of losing control, taking things into their own hands, no hope for the future, low self-esteem. Big changes in personality could also be someone who's been very, very depressed, and all of a sudden they're fine, right? Like everything's good, I'm going to be fine. Like maybe they have a plan, and that's why they've shifted mentality. The idea with all of these is somebody has a lot of vulnerabilities and hopelessness for the future. And so the big thing that you want to do is do something to help them, right? Whether that's getting them connected to help, keeping them company, right? So that they don't feel like they're alone. This can be a difficult one to manage. It was my least favorite part of being a therapist when I was a therapist. People who were suicidal, just worrying, are you going to come back next week, right? Am I going to see you again? Because this can be really overwhelming. I'm sure a lot of you have known people who have been suicidal or maybe even committed or attempted suicide. It's something when people are overwhelmed with depression, they're not thinking clearly. And it can be a very common pursuit that people make, or just self-harming behaviors as well. So always better, I think, in my opinion, to overreact, care too much. I always operate under the assumption of people will forgive me for doing too much, but can I forgive myself for not doing enough? That's always kind of been my approach with suicidality. And trying to get people help or connected to services, or just being there for them oftentimes can be really, really helpful. But very strongly correlated with mood disorders. Causes of mood disorders, very common that they're biological. We talked about neurotransmitters. Serotonin and dopamine are big culprits when it comes to mood disorders. Right? A lot of people have chemical imbalances, which is why they take medication. And we'll talk about medication more next week. Social and psychological and cognitive factors. Depression has a lot of cognitive elements to it. People get caught in this cognitive distortion loop where they think very unrealistically about the world, which leads to more feelings of emptiness and sadness, which leads to more cognitive distortions, which leads to more, and round and round and round you go. And so it can be very difficult to break that cycle. But thinking about the world illogically, like I'm worthless, thinking very black and white ways. Things are either one way or the other, and there's no middle ground, which is often not true. There's often a lot of gray, right? But people who are depressed often see the world in very black and white, kind of overgeneralization sort of ways, which can cause a lot more issues and fuel depression even more. And again, these often dictate the treatments, which we'll talk more about in the next chapter. Yeah. There can be, right? People developing depression because they struggle with their ADHD, right? It can definitely happen. Depression is so common, right? And it, if you're feeling different and outcasted and struggling because of something like ADHD, it makes sense that maybe at some point you do develop depression as you are struggling with one thing, it can lead to struggling with something else.
Because with ADHD, isn't there like a lack of like dopamine production? So
Dopamine could be part of it. It's oftentimes more things like acetylcholine and things that are more related to like attention and activity, glutamate and a few others. But dopamine is part of it. And interestingly, antidepressants are often used for anxiety disorders and mood disorders. So they're often used for a lot of different things. You might have somebody struggling with ADHD on an antidepressant. Typically, they take a stimulant like Ritalin or something similar. But it could also be that they're taking an antidepressant to help with that side of it as well. Very common for disorders to occur together. Call that comorbidity. Not super common for people to have more than like 2 disorders, but 1 or 2 disorders occurring together is relatively common. Schizophrenia, the most severe of the disorders that we'll talk about. Schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder. Psychosis. If someone is psychotic or has psychosis, they have a loss of contact with reality. So a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia has a lot of elements of people not being in touch with reality, seeing things that aren't there, believing things that aren't true, right? Having a lot of like strange perceptions and ideas about the world around them. Schizophrenia is a very difficult disorder. Again, it falls into the psychotic disorders where people have kind of strange disturbances in thoughts, emotions, behaviors, communications, and so on. Again, featured in movies a lot, right? The Soloist, really great portrayal of this. Older one, A Beautiful Mind. There's lots of movies that are featuring examples of schizophrenia. Not to go back to Batman again, but the new Joker movie, right? With, what's his name? Just forgot. Thank you. The new Joker movie, they portray him as having schizophrenia. Really interesting. It was a totally different take on like the Joker character. It's a hard movie to watch. I don't know if any of you watched it, but it's like, it's uncomfortable and it's sad, right? But it was such a different take. He sees things that aren't there, right? He has these interactions with people that aren't true. He laughs at times where it's inappropriate to laugh. It's actually a very common portrayal of schizophrenia. So interesting, you see this in the movies again a lot. Very different from dissociative identity disorder. Remember, that has 2 or more personalities. This is one personality, but that personality isn't in contact with reality and really struggles with a lot of different symptoms, which fall into generally 3 categories: positive, negative, and psychomotor. Psychology is like really bad about this. We say positive and negative a lot, and we never mean it as good and bad. Positive here means excesses. So behaviors that are in excess or like beyond what is normal and typical. And positive symptoms of schizophrenia are so common. Hallucinations and delusions being the 2 big ones. Hallucinations are the most common symptom of schizophrenia. Hearing things or seeing things that aren't there. And if you've ever hallucinated for whatever reason, maybe you haven't slept, maybe due to a drug, maybe due to a chemical imbalance, it can be really frightening. Right? I hallucinated once, right? I was prescribed a medication as a teenager and I had a really negative effect, like reaction to it. And I was hallucinating for like 4 hours. And it's like one of the most scared like memories I have. Like I remember seeing everything was like moving and floating. Like there was a desk floating. I like just cried. It scared me so badly. I can't even imagine living like that. Right? People who live with schizophrenia are constantly hearing voices that aren't there, constantly seeing things that aren't there. I mean, I can't focus when people are talking around me, let alone if someone was talking to me that wasn't real, right? Which makes it really hard to stay in contact with reality. Yeah.
So, grandpa's son, it's like, we have a situation, but my grandpa's son had like a really bad hallucination one night where everything was on fire.
Okay.
Just like, I think it's also because of medication. Like thinking about how is that based off of any fear, or is it just something that your mind does and comes up with in your brain?
It's related chemically to too much dopamine, right? An excess of dopamine causes you to see and hear things that aren't there, or at least that's the thought. But the things that people hear and see are often on like the negative side. Like most of the time they're on the like the paranoid or negative side. So it could be fear-based or anxiety-based. very oftentimes the things that people hear are very like insecure and negative or menacing in nature. And I'm not sure we really know why, other than I think it does kind of lend itself to like that fear or insecurity element. But that's relatively common, unfortunately. Yeah.
When I heard my great grandmother was a schizophrenic.
Or had schizophrenia, right? Yeah.
Is something like that, or
It can be. There is a little bit of a genetic piece. That doesn't mean you're like, you're gonna get it.
there's a lot of, like, my sister actually got diagnosed with personality or mood swing.
Okay.
Not disorder, but right when you said, or not bipolar, but right when you said bipolar, it was exactly what it
Sure.
seemed like. But there's that. My great grandmother was schizophrenic, and there's a lot of substance issues
Sure.
with my family, which I can only see with me.
Mhm.
I was just wondering if stuff like that was alright.
It can't, so schizophrenia, mood disorders are very genetic. There's about like, I think it's 27% likelihood if a biological parent has it, that a biological child would then develop it. Now, 27%, like that doesn't mean in any way that you're going to have it, but you might be more vulnerable than the average person. Schizophrenia, interestingly, a couple of years ago, we started to notice some genetic markers for it, some genetic like chromosomal expressions. Now we are like in the very early stages of identifying it, but there does seem to be some genetic like elements to schizophrenia. Now it's thought to be a little bit more like environmentally triggered. Remember that diathesis stress perspective that we mentioned last time, where people are genetically prone, but then they have to have an environmental trigger. So if you never have the environmental trigger, you might not ever develop it. But it's not as genetic as like mood disorders. Mood disorders tend to run in families more than schizophrenia does.
Yeah, so like I said, my mom's side has a lot of alcoholics.
Sure.
Like I already said, I could see it with myself.
Yeah, and so knowing that that runs in the family, it's important to be more careful with your use of substances, right?
And like my dad's side, it's kind of weird to explain.
Sure.
But like my grandmother, I don't like, she was very she was just horrible. Like she was abused my aunts, and I think she like said a lot of really mean things to my sister. I don't know if that was like kind of sociopathic.
Sure.
But and like my aunt heard this story that my dad told me. She like buried puppies alive. Something like that. Like so
Wow.
there's a lot of when I hear stuff like that, I think like that's
So it sounds like, there's a lot of, and I think what's hard is if you think about like nature and nurture, right? Which we talked about forever ago, like months ago in nature and nurture. If you grow up in a household where there's a lot of mental illness, whether it's addiction, schizophrenia, mood disorders, whatever it might be, right? That environment, it might cause somebody to develop those different disorders because that's what they've seen and they're being modeled of, right? So if you grew up in a household where there's a lot of mood disorders, you could learn that that's the normal way of behaving and you kind of end up with it on accident. Or we go the opposite of our parents. A lot of us go the opposite. But if you have a parent who has issues with substances, you might be like, I'm never using a substance, right? Very common for us to go the opposite direction of a parent. But it could be somewhat genetic or it could be somewhat environmental, right? And it's so hard to know which, but if you know that something runs in a family, then you want to obviously be a little more careful. Like if substance abuse runs in a family, you might want to be really careful with substances, right? If mood disorders run in a family, then finding good ways to manage your mood and kind of keep it from ever escalating. That's where like the prevention pieces come in.
like with my sister, she'll come home from work
Uh-huh.
and she'll either be like extraordinarily happy about something, like it's the best day of her life, or
Sure.
she will be super depressed.
Yeah.
And it will be like something will happen at work that'll be like barely any.
Mm-hmm.
But she's talked about
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if she think I took her to some counselors or psychiatrists.
Sure.
They just said a mood swing disorder, but
Mhm.
yeah, just wondering.
Yeah, and I mean, again, mood disorders really common. And a lot of disorders can be very mild. I mean, if we want to be liberal, I mean, we could probably all find some disorder that we could be diagnosed with, like easily. I'm sure every single one of you we could find something if we really wanted to, right? And I think it depends on your perspective and your therapist, if you have one. Like a lot of people go to therapy. I go to therapy. I've gone to therapy since I was a baby. My parents believed in therapy. Like, I'm pretty sure as a baby, I was like crying and analyzing Rorschachs. Like, a therapist was like, "What do you see?" And I'm like, "Meh," right? I mean, I'm pretty positive, just like that. I'm pretty positive that, like, as a baby, like, I was in therapy. My family just believed in therapy, which is partly why I think I wanted to become a therapist. Like, I was like, oh, it could be helpful for anyone. And I still go. I go every week, and I enjoy going. I get to talk to someone randomly, and it doesn't go back to anyone else, right? I can say whatever I want. And hopefully it never goes to anyone, right? As long as I don't violate those like confidentiality things, like, it's private. Like, it's so, I think anyone can benefit from, you know, whatever things we struggle with in life, whether it's friendships or anxiety or mood or, you know, dealing with COVID or the anxiety of a test. I personally tend to think that therapy can be very helpful. My partner thinks therapy is like the biggest waste of time in the world. Her family comes from a very like traditional Hispanic Catholic family, which I'm really popular with, you can imagine. But like, from her perspective, therapy is an absolute waste of time, right? Like, why would you go? You just paid a stranger to listen to your issues. I'm like, I've seen her for years. She's not a stranger. I know her well, right? But yeah, I did pay her, and that's fine, right? Like, it's interesting. There's so many like stigmas around mental health and therapy, and you know, and sometimes for a good reason, and other times I think it can be really helpful for anyone. If you know that things run in a family, then you might be more vulnerable. Couldn't hurt to, like, you know, be proactive about it. Was there another hand? Yeah, you had your hand.
So with schizophrenia, so I know that you take hallucinogenics,
Mhm.
and that you could have a chance of like relapsing into like that hallucinogenic state without even taking the drug.
Mhm.
That leads to something like schizophrenia.
Yeah.
Like get into hallucinogenic and stuff, and then like you don't know what's real and what's not.
Yeah. So if you use a drug, like a hallucinogen, right? Like, say LSD, for example, would be the most common. Say you abuse LSD and it causes you to develop schizophrenia. We would call that drug-induced schizophrenia. Okay, so schizophrenia can be the result of drug use. It happens sometimes where people use a drug, it alters their brain chemistry, and they never go back, right? Which is why we have so many scare tactics with that, right? Like, don't use this, it could cause schizophrenia. That would only happen if you were biologically prone to get it. That would be the diathesis that triggers that predisposition. So it could be an event, it could be a drug, it could be a trauma, but that can happen for people, and it could be permanent or it could be short-term. And there's no way of knowing, which sometimes is what makes drugs like hallucinogens so scary, right? That they could have that effect. Any drug can have a permanent effect if it hits you the wrong way, right? Like I told all of you, I was in the hospital from cough medicine. I mean, give me a break. I took Delcium, which is a cough medicine, and it interacted with a different medication that I'm on. It nearly killed me. Like, ridiculous. Like, you have no way of knowing. I had no way of knowing that until I was there, right? And so that's, I think, sometimes what makes substances so scary is you just never know how your body's going to react to them. Right? Yeah, so go way back and look. Okay, what? Oh, yeah. I said weed, but weed. It could, marijuana is very, very less likely. Very less, much less likely. I don't think you would have met, much less likely to do something else. It's typically more, I mean, it depends on the strain. So there are some very intense strains of marijuana, which are hallucinogens. Marijuana is considered like hallucinogenic. So it could, but it's just way less common than more like harder drugs like LSD and things that tend to lead to more like intense hallucinations. Marijuana can have like a hallucinogenic property to it, but it's not usually as severe as something like this. And it activates different receptors than things like LSD. Yeah, because everything is out of whack. Your brain has like swelled right? Everything, or like for me, my blood pressure was really high, and that made me see things like everything felt unreal. But when your body is out of like balance in any way, your neurotransmitters, your temperature, your hydration level, right? Your sleep, right? Things don't function properly. If you are overly tired and haven't slept, you'll see things that aren't there, right? Like I know you've all done it, right? Like you think you see that shadow walk by and you're like, I need to get some sleep. But very common when our system isn't working properly that things happen. It's just a, fever, overtired, medications, all of those things can do it. You had your hand up.
So. I kind of forgot my question, I'm sorry.
I can come back to you if you want.
Yeah.
You want a minute? Okay, was there, yeah.
I heard that like marijuana can like unlock like the mental conditions that like your family might have. Like I have a friend whose like mom had like schizophrenia,
Mhm.
and then like his brother like started smoking like a lot, and then like just out of nowhere he started like having symptoms.
Sure. I mean, any drug can kind of have that effect, right? That's again, the frightening thing. Drugs affect us unpredictably. And right, so maybe for someone, it is that trigger, right? It's not super common. I mean, marijuana has its own effects, right? It affects memory, motivation, cognitive ability, but it doesn't tend to as commonly lead to like some of the like bigger issues like we're talking about, though it can for some people, right? One kind of atypical effect of marijuana is that it causes some people to become wildly paranoid, right? And paranoia can be a very common symptom of schizophrenia. And so that's where you might see some overlap. It's not the most common, but it can definitely happen for sure. Came back to you.
So if you have like any parents like have like any kind of disorder, like ADHD, schizophrenia, is it most likely to like go to the children as well as genetics or no?
I mean, typically you're a little bit more vulnerable, but it doesn't mean that you'll get it. Like my mom has bipolar disorder. My brother and I don't have bipolar disorder, right? Not that I know of right now. I mean, by now I'm 40, like if I was gonna get it, I should have had it. Knock on something. But it doesn't mean that you're doomed to get it, but you are probably slightly more vulnerable than the average person.
What about like the more common disorders like ADHD and
Almost every disorder has some degree of a genetic component. It might be very minor. Mood disorders, like I said, are much higher, like in the high 20s. ADHD, some of that's more environmental. If you grow up with a parent that has ADHD, you might develop ADHD because that's how you learned your model of how to pay attention and how to function. And so is it genetic or not? That's hard to know, right? Yeah.
This is really study on genetics.
Sure.
Yesterday, some of the relatives they want to follow up.
Yeah. That's a hard one. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And there's a lot of research. We're always doing research, trying to understand the vulnerabilities and the longitudinal stuff and the long-term effects of things. It's important. That's how we learn, right? That's how we learn all this. So these excess symptoms are very common. Again, hearing and seeing things that aren't there are hallucinations, delusions, when you have a false belief about reality, right? These can be delusions of grandeur. When you have delusions of grandeur, you tend to think you're somebody really important or like a prominent figure or a religious figure. When you have delusions of paranoia, you think people are out to get you. There's a microphone up there and they're recording everything right now. We're being watched by the government. Not to plant like an idea in your mind, right? But it's that kind of stuff constantly. Like, oh, I can't do this because somebody's watching me. Or like, what's that little thing, that little box back there? You see that little thing on the wall right there? What is that? What's it covering, right? It's just a constant paranoia. Everything, I'm like giving you things to be afraid of in the classroom. Like, but it's very common with schizophrenia to have hallucinations and delusions. That people are out to get you, that you're somebody important. Delusions of reference are actually also really common, like you obsess about a number or little like meaningless things. Negative symptoms are common, but they're not nearly as what's the word, like profound in a way. They tend to be a little less severe. It's stuff like not talking a whole lot, not moving a whole lot, being almost like comatose. People who have the negative symptoms don't tend to move, talk, or show a lot of emotion, which is another way this can present. The psychomotor ones, people who just might like sit in one position for days or weeks at a time have weird grimaces or movements. Maybe they're constantly going like this. They're pushing a button that we can't see, right? Like lots of grimaces and movements and tics are common with schizophrenia. But in general, with all of these, they kind of cause you to lose contact with reality. Because you have these abnormal and kind of bizarre things going on, it makes it where you start to withdraw from the people around you. The more you withdraw, the more these things tend to increase. And then they tend to get more and more severe. Very commonly caused, as I said, by like dopamine and that diathesis stress, that trigger, that environmental trigger that might cause it to come forward. And that could be a drug or an event. And there are medications that people take for this, which we'll talk about next week. Lots of medications that can help, but they tend to be a little bit hard to tolerate as well. There's two more groups of disorders just to mention, and I went into these a little bit more in the book, but there are disorders of childhood and disorders of aging. Disorders of childhood, and we've kind of talked about ADHD a couple of times. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder used to be ADD and ADHD. Now there's just ADHD. Right? So if anyone says I have ADD, they don't know enough to even like describe their diagnosis, right? ADHD, there's no ADD in it, doesn't exist. ADHD is when people have that like inattention and hyperactivity and impulsiveness. It's a disorder of childhood. It shows up in the childhood years. Oftentimes kids start to struggle with school and paying attention. It can persist into adulthood, but it shows up as a child, right? And it tends to be something that most people learn to live with or outgrow, but it can last into the adult years. Autistic spectrum disorder. This one's a very big umbrella, right? Autism or autistic spectrum disorder includes a whole bunch of different things, from very mild to very severe. There's a lot of like poor communication skills, unresponsiveness to others, like language and communication issues and repetitive motor movements. If somebody is on the spectrum, what that means is they have an autistic spectrum disorder. And maybe they're very mild, but it could go all the way up to being very severe as well. There's other ones like intellectual developmental disorder as well, but these are two of the more common disorders of childhood. And then on the flip side, there are disorders of aging. As we get older, we become more vulnerable to things like dementia. Neurocognitive disorders or dementias are when people start to lose like cognitive functioning as they age. Alzheimer's is the most common type of dementia, right? Or neurocognitive disorder. They're used interchangeably. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think, it's like you said for the child, do you think someone can like grow out of ADHD?
For sure. Yeah. A lot of people do. It tends to be something that oftentimes people learn to manage and they outgrow it by the time they're through their adolescent years or early adulthood. Some people have it forever. It depends on how severe it is, if you got treatment for it, if you learned ways of coping with it. My nephew has ADHD, and his way of coping with it is he has a cup of like coffee before school every day, and the coffee calms him down. Really interesting. Oftentimes people who have ADHD are calmed down by stimulants. So someone who has ADHD drinks a cup of coffee and it actually mellows them out. It's a very common like little trick for people who struggle with ADHD. My daughter, Emma, pretty sure has ADHD. Like, because if she has a soda, like we'll give her a Coke, which we don't do very often because she's 7, 8 this weekend, 7 right now. She's still 7 for 4 more days. All right, 2 cakes though this weekend. 2 kids, 2 cakes. Very excited. Anyway, talking about something else. But for her, if we give her a soda, like it calms her down. Ritalin is a stimulant, right? And so oftentimes people who have ADHD take a stimulant to calm down. Right. It's almost like they're understimulated, which leads to inattention and so on. But you can outgrow it for sure. So Alzheimer's is the most common type of dementia, very common after the age of 65, sadly. 1 in 10 people develop Alzheimer's after the age of 65. And the older you get, the more vulnerable you are to it. Right. It's a very common disease of aging, and it has to do with these 2 parts, these neurofibrillary tangles and senile plaques that we all possess, but they build up in our system as we get older, and they start to interfere with cognitive functioning, starting with very, very recent stuff like little slips of memory. Where did I put my keys? I can't remember so-and-so's name. And it gets worse and worse and worse until eventually people literally don't remember anything, and their body almost forgets how to function, and it oftentimes, in the end, becomes fatal. About 8 to 10 years, people tend to live with this. Yeah.
really tool.
Uh-huh.
It's so far and something for my birthday party.
Okay.
It was in June.
Okay, yeah. And sadly, as we get older, we do more and more of that. Like oh my gosh, my in-laws, I hear the same story over. I'm like, I know, Mom, you told me that like 3 times today, right? It's just common as we get older, but it's a whole nother level. And we're kind of out of time. So write down your questions. We can talk about it in the beginning. Next time we'll come back to the slide and we'll come back and talk about it. But have a wonderful weekend. We'll keep going. We'll finish this up and then talk about treatments when we meet on Monday.